Okay, alrighty. Well, let's get started, everyone. Hello and welcome to this year's Seedling Sale webinar. This is a compilation collaboration event between the Benzie, Leelanau, and Grand Traverse Conservation Districts. My name is Allie Hetmer. I'm with Grand Traverse, and we are also going to be talking with Ellie Johnson, who's a district forester for all three of those districts, and my colleague at Grand Traverse, Cam Evans. He's one of our parkland stewards over there. So first, yeah, let's see what that meant. So we're going to talk a little bit about, this webinar is going to be 3 different sections. I'll talk a little bit about your seedlings journey from the nursery to your landscape. Cam will cover a lot of things about your site preparation and how to care for your seedlings as you're planting it, and then afterwards. And then Ellie will dive into the whole big world of site selection and species selection, how they all fit together, ecology, and just all the good stuff, all the really tree specific questions that you guys might have. So just to start off, so conservation districts, we've been hosting seedling sales for a long time. They're a big part of our fundraisers, and so districts across the state do this every year in the springtime. And we don't grow our own trees. We're sourcing these trees from nurseries across the state. The DNR maintains a current list of everyone who's licensed to sell trees within the state of Michigan, and that's where we go to. So there is actually one district in the state, Newaygo. They have a nursery, and that's always great to buy trees from them, support another conservation district. We love to see it. So I get trees from them every year. But so basically your trees, they are coming from the nurseries. So they're grown there and the district source them. And then each district, they're on a little bit of a different schedule as far as like when they receive the trees, when they're picked up, when you, the customer, picks them up. But so generally we receive the trees from the nurseries about a week and a half before the customer pickup dates. And then there's just a big week of packing and putting the orders together and everything like that. And that's a combination of district staff, volunteers, our board members. It's just a real big community event to kind of like get all of those together and get them ready for you to take them home at the end of the day. So there's the products that you're getting, the seedlings themselves. There are kind of like a few terms that you might have heard thrown around, you know, from a couple of different nurseries or people that you talk to. So there are seedlings and there are transplants, and they're both they're very similar in that they're both bare root products with no soil. They don't come in pots. In the conservation district world, we just kind of use the word seedling as a catch-all for both. The main difference between those two is which bed they've lived in during their lives. So a seedling bed, that's just where the plant was originally planted. And so they're all kind of like squished together. Everyone's hanging out with their friends. And then the transplant beds, they're a little bit older, and so they're moved and they have a little bit more space to grow, a little bit more space for the root mass to develop. And so you kind of have a little bit of a higher quality product when a tree is moved from the seedling to the transplant bed. And this information about what is a seedling versus what is a transplant is available on order forms from all three, Benzie, Grand Traverse, and Leelanau. So the way to read that, so you'll see one number and then a dash and another number. And so the 1-0 indicates that the tree has spent 1 year in its little seedling bed and then 0 years in a transplant bed. But then you'll get down to example, a 2-1. So that little seedling there has spent 2 years in its original seedling bed, also in love with its friends, and then 1 more year and a little bit more space that area, a little bit more space for the roots to develop. And then there's the side class of your seedling. So we measure that in inches, and it's the height of the plant from above the ground. And so that height that's listed on the order forms or on the websites, that doesn't include the root mass. And then that's just measured in inches. So on the Leelanau order form, you can see that the age class is listed there in parentheses right behind the species name. And then they have the size just there in its own separate column. This is from the Grand Traverse website, and so that information is just listed right under the species name. It says the size and then the age class right there. And then this is from Benzie, and so they have it written out in the description of the species on their website. And we'll go a little bit more later into how to order seedlings from each of the counties. And then your seedlings at the end of the day, I just kind of wanted to give you some perspective on like size and actual physical space that these things take up. Like, what are you taking home? You know, the measurement of the inches and everything, it just kind of, it doesn't always like translate, you know, because it's like, how big is it really? And then you've got a bundle of like 5, 10, 25, 50, or 100 trees. And like, really, what does that look like? So anyways, I've got a couple of examples here. The picture there on the left, those are just some little tiny guys. I'm guessing that picture, those seedlings were probably in a size class of like 4 to 8 inches, so like very small. And there's about 10 trees there per bundle. And then the middle picture there, this is actually a picture of me wrapping seedlings from a couple of years ago. I thought it would be helpful to have a human for scale. That is a bundle of 25 tulip poplar trees that are 18 to 24 inches tall. So the little, anyways, the little line you can see on the image right above the orange tab, which is a line of twine that's holding them all together, that's about where the actual like above ground part of the plant starts. So everything below that, that's all wrapped up in the paper, that's all going to be root mass there. And then there on the right picture, white pine, those are bundles of 50, 18 to 24 inches, and they're quite bulky. So the cage that it's in, this isn't a great perspective picture, but it's about 1.5 feet tall. So you can see then it goes maybe another like foot above that. And then those ones are a little bit bulky. So this is just an overview of what exactly you'll be taking home. All of the districts also sell care items, a variety of care items. Some common ones that all of us are selling, tree tubes. Actually, I'm so sorry. I don't know if Leelanau is. We can check in on that later. But each district has a variety of things that will help you take care of your trees after they're planted. Tree tubes are a very common one. They'll help prevent from wildlife browse. Garlic repellent sticks are also something that are meant to deter wildlife. Pin flags, you can remember where you put stuff. And then TerraSorb is a product that holds water. And so you can mix that in the soil when you plant your trees, and it'll kind of help draw moisture from the soil to your roots. And so they're supposed to help support the tree in its first few years of life as it retains moisture there and just kind of gives it a higher chance of surviving. So this webinar is for a combination of Grand Traverse, Leelanau, and Benzie residents. And if you're from elsewhere, that's also too, we're happy to have you. But I recognize that probably a lot of people came to us from different avenues. Maybe you're a repeat seedling sale customer. Maybe this is your first time. Maybe you came to us through you're doing an NRCS planting, or maybe you are participating in the Conservation Resource Alliance's Wild Roots program. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of those for folks who maybe didn't come to us through those avenues, just so you're familiar with who we're working with during this time of year. So if you did come to us from NRCS, you'll be familiar with this. The EQIP and CSP programs, it's all about conservation resource practices. And so there's different like activities that you can do within those programs, and tree and shrub planting is one of them. And so you go through the whole entire land management plan, and then it's a reimbursement program. So you get money for planting trees and undertaking other conservation practices on your property. if that's something that sounds interesting to you, if you are managing forest land, if you're looking to improve wildlife habitat or regenerate native vegetation, or if in general you're just excited about land stewardship, I have some contact information and further details about how to get started with NRCS and how to find more information about those programs on one of the next slides here. And then Wild Roots is a program that's run by the Conservation Resource Alliance. This is a cost share program. They have some grants that, so you'll purchase like a package of tree tubes from them, and then you'll get a voucher for seedlings at one of your chosen conservation districts. And all three of the districts that we're talking with tonight, we all participate in this program. It's great. It's a good way to, you know, get involved and get tree tubes and get trees in the ground. That's one of the partners that we're working with during the tree sale season. And this is just our little quick screenshot that we grabbed from NRCS. Just a very brief overview of how to get assistance from them. You have to make a land management plan, fill out the application, all that sort of stuff. The whole process, it does take kind of a while, but it's a great resource for folks. And so just kind of breeze through that. And then we do have this contact information for those folks. And I'm sorry, I should have said this right at the beginning. I did rather just dive right in, but we're recording this. And so we'll be sending this information out to all of you guys that are here with us tonight, and also everybody else who registered. And then we'll be posting this webinar on our YouTube page as well, if you want to check it out later or share it with a friend. And so ordering our trees, both Benzie and Grand Traverse Conservation Districts have online ordering. So links to our websites are just here. Benzie's sale is currently open. It closes on Thursday, March 28th. Grand Traverse, again, currently open. We will close down on Sunday, March 31st. And Leelanau has an order form. List out all, we had a quick screenshot of it earlier, list out all the trees, all the species. They even have beach grass, which is a fun one. I'm not selling that. I don't think Benzie is either. But so there's an order form you can just fill out. You can send that to Karen over at the Leelanau office, or you can mail it in to them as well. And the address to mail that to is just listed there on the order form. And their order deadline is a little bit later. It's April 12th. And then once you finalize your order with each district, you'll receive further instructions and information regarding like pickup dates and times and locations and everything like that. That's my brief overview. And then Cam is going to talk to us about how to prepare tonight. So I will switch over.
Hello, everybody. I am Cameron Evans. I'm a parkland steward with the Grand Traverse Conservation District. Hopefully everybody can see this. It's a little glitchy on my end for the moment. We're going to start right off with seedling prep and considerations that you should take before and after planting your seedlings. Your desired goals. So before you begin, you need to ask yourself a bunch of questions, you know, whether it's, am I planting the right type of seedling? Am I looking to plant tree plantation? Am I going to have enough seedlings for the goal that I'm trying to achieve? How much water am I going to need? Is it going to be easily accessible for those tree plantings and or seedlings? How can I protect them? What if wildlife gets into these? You know, all sorts of questions you need to ask yourself before you start planting your seedling. Um, other things that can go into this um, are land management goals, reforestation goals. You can have things such as, your buffer system, windbreaks, privacy screens, all sorts of different aspects in that you may be willing to get or you're looking to get out of planting your seedlings. So you just really need to have a goal in mind or a, an objective for what you're looking to get out. You know, for example, this year I planted 12 mass producing apple trees on my property because I have old apple trees and I'm looking to replace those apple trees with the new ones as the years are progressing. So, I'm looking at the biodiversity of different types of apple trees and what type of wildlife that's going to bring to my property. So we'll move on um, to the site preparation of what we're going to need for our seedling. You may have different land locations, all different kinds. For me, I got agricultural land. Some of you may have forest property, urban or rural, maybe just at your house in the backyard. But once again, I put under here different bullet points that you may want to hit and or touch on when you're planting seedlings, so for agricultural, there may be those old farm fields, field edges, the roadsides that you might want that privacy screen or that windbreak for your crops. There's the forest canopy. So you got canopy cover, leaf litter, the sticks and twigs. You want to be prepared for all of those aspects when you're getting ready to prepare your site. And you want to be thinking about those with your goals in mind. The most important thing I would like to say with having your site prep is the things you got to keep in mind. The power lines, the structures, your foundation of your house and or building, shed, garage, your sidewalk, your water source. Like I mentioned earlier, how far away are you from your water source? Are you 300 yards away and your water source is right at your house? I mean, that's a long way to carry a water bucket. So, you want to keep these things in mind as you're moving forward. I'm about to touch on a couple brief preparation methods that you will use or most people use when planting seedlings. The four to cover are mechanical, chemical, prescribed burns, and cover crops. So the mechanical method is pretty much the standard method. We use it here at Grand Traverse Conservation District quite often. We just use shovels, hand trowels, rakes, leaf blowers, anything to get that surface scratched up and broken apart. That's the most important part, is making sure you got a nice clean area to work with and be able to dig and plant your seedling. I put a couple pictures on here for everybody. You got the hand auger on the right, which the guy is using to be able to plant a nice hole. Problem is he doesn't have a lot of cover on the ground, so that actually is susceptible to a bunch of invasives invading that area because you have no ground cover. So it's easy for invasives to come in. But there are other methods. There's the tractor implements. So as you can see, there looks like they're getting ready to plant a bunch of pine trees. And, this may be good for people who are looking to plant maybe a timber harvest property. So you may be looking to plant a bunch of red pines. And so this may be useful to use heavy equipment such as a tractor and a planter on the back. So there's just a couple mechanical methods you can use. My favorite, had the most success with personally, is just by hand using a shovel. Yeah, we'll move on from there. It's pretty cut and dry. We'll move on to the chemical aspect. So everybody's pretty shy and afraid to use the herbicides, which is understandable. I don't recommend everybody using this type of method, but it is a method to use. The problem with it can be costly. Most type of herbicides, you will have to have your commercial pesticide applicator license. However, they do have herbicides and whatnot you can use over the counter. But the most important thing I can say is always read that label. The label is the law when it comes to herbicide and pesticides. There's methods involved with spraying and using chemicals. You get your hand sprayer, your backpack sprayer, the tractor, which comes in usually the boom sprayer, aerial, helicopter, plane, drone. There's all sorts of applications for applying herbicides. And this is all, like I said, this is all gonna come right back to the beginning of what are your goals for the seedling planting? What are you starting off with a field full of invasive autumn olive, may have honeysuckle, it could have buckthorn. You might want to nuke that whole area that you're working with and make sure that those plants that are going to come back pretty mean are going to be gone. And this is one that I would recommend for a site just like that, actually. You won't have any issues, with the herbicide afterwards. I would, definitely give it a year, wait for all the things to die, and then work that in and or remove it, properly burn it and dispose of it, and then replant your site. From there, we'll move on to the next one. So this is a prescribed burn. This is another technique. I don't recommend this one to anybody. I wouldn't steer anybody, even my colleagues, in this direction because it is dangerous, as everybody knows, dealing with fire. The three main techniques, though, to fire, I will just briefly touch on the diagrams here. Bottom right is the guy fully loaded in PPE, protective or personal protective equipment, or proper, I think. But anyway, I forget what that is at the hot moment. Personal protective equipment. Anyway, so there's a backing fire, which you're going to see on the upper right-hand side, which gives you that little graph underneath, so temperature over time. You got your strip heading fire. That's on the left picture, which shows also that temperature over time. Very hot, burns very fast right in the beginning, and then cools off and slows down as we go on. And as you can see in the third one is the flanking fire, which is the middle picture. Like I said, I'm not going to touch on this one too much. This is something that if you're gonna do on a bigger site and a bigger parcel, I recommend you call your local DNR office. They will help you get assistance in that because you will probably need the fire department and many other entities to help with this prescribed burn that you may do. Cover crops. Cover crops is another method to site prep. So like we brought up earlier with agricultural fields, your planting times may range depending on your cover crop of choice. There's three main basics. We got the brassicas, grains and grasses, and legumes. I personally like to use cereal rye and ryegrass on my property for cover crops and getting nitrogen into the soil, which is very important, and having that nitrogen fixation within the ground and giving the proper nutrients to your plants and trees or seedlings that you're planting. So not only is the cover crop beneficial for the ground and the soil health, it also helps with the erosion control, which, as stated, and everybody knows that, or should know, with planted plants in the ground and having a nice solid base root layer and root mass, that provides stable substrate. That really helps out for water washout and retention of banks or ledges or anything pretty much like that. So cover crops can be very important and a very beneficial site prep. This also goes to you know, what is your goal? Do you have a timber harvest that you're getting ready to harvest? And then, I don't know, you want to plant some new things in there, but your soil health is not proper. You might have to incorporate some cover crops to be able to get that nitrogen in the ground and better soil health. So the last site prep, I said there was 4, but this 5th one here is just the final nice golden touch because it's important if you're living in the urban and rural areas. Misdig, give them a call, 811. It's free. They come out, they mark your utilities. You don't want to be able to cut the power. You don't want to cut the internet to your house, to the neighbor's house, maybe to the business down the street. Just be sure to call Misdig if you're dealing with any plantings within power utilities or anything. It's just worth the call to call Misdig. I threw this couple pictures on here just before we get into a little description on how to plant a seedling. So this is your utility corridor, pretty much standard planting diagram. I threw a DTE energy one on the right for your recommendations for tree planting. I'm just going to brief it over with what knowledge I've gained over the years with working with the conservation district is that, you can plant shrubs. I wouldn't even go trees. I would just say shrubs within areas of power utility lines because they're not looking for any high sort of growth. The power utility companies will come through and they'll mow it all down. Their goal here is to access that power line in case anything happens. So really very satellite populations of shrubs, bushes, those type of seedlings that you may get from your local supplier. Just be very aware that anything in the utility corridor, 5 to 10 years is probably going to get mowed down by that utility company. So as long as it's a bush and they can maneuver it and they can get to that power pole, it'll most likely stay and they won't worry about anything like that. So we'll move on to planting. Let's start planting your seedling. So we always want to start off a site preparation by clearing away the debris, vegetation around the planting site. You don't want any competition. You want to be able to prepare the hole as deep, if not deeper, than the root mass of the seedling and at least twice the width of the root mass. This ensures that you get enough compaction when you're planting your seedling and your roots are not J-rooting, which we'll talk about in a little bit because that's not, we don't want to do that. And it causes mortality to the seedling. From there, we'll move on. It's always a good idea to pre-dampen the hole in which you're planting the seedling. This just makes sure the hole gets, water down there already at that depth. Just happens quick. Why not start the water process immediately? Make sure to properly plant the seedling. On the right hand side, I put a picture over there. You don't want to make sure your root collar is too low. That'll kill the plant pretty much immediately. Within that same year, root collar too high, same exact effect. You want to make sure that root collar is literally just below the seedling stem. So when you're properly planting the seedling, you got to have that correct depth. You want to make sure that J-root, the root does not go up and face towards the sky, or else most likely, well, the seedling will not make it. However, as you're planting the seedling, you want the seedling to be roots all the way down, straight down, and you want to slowly pack that soil in on top, nice and firm and tight, all the way up to that root collar. That's a very important stage, is making sure that compact soil, we don't want any air pockets in there. Next, we're going to want to mulch. And we'll keep away from the seedling stem. I got slides upcoming that shows a perfect example of this. And water. Water is the next most important thing. Make sure to periodically water your seedling. On the right, for when we get to reference this back, or you guys get to reference back, I just got some checklist things. You just want to make sure your soil's compact. A berm can be created. guess I forgot to mention that, but a berm can be created around your seedling. That means when you come back to water it, the water stays right next to your seedling. It focuses that channel right down to the root system. So yeah, have that berm created. 2, make sure there's wood chips there. You know, that helps retain the moisture. That's a big thing. Number 3, tree stakes and tube. Depends on what you're planting. Remember, what are your goals? You know, are the deer very, very hungry? You might need a tree stake and tube to be able to deter that deer. Also, you might need a tree fence and or barrier. For rabbits, you might need a little bit of a tree fence for that stem so they don't girdle the tree. There's just a couple little checklists that I would recommend you hit as you're planting your seedling. I just threw on here just a couple things after this planting, so you guys got an idea of what I was talking about. But on the right, we have the soil burn and how it's actually the wood chips are put away from that stem. That's very important. And I put it on there so everybody can visually see it, can come back, no brainer. The middle picture here, you can see he's got the tree stake there, the fence around the tree shelter, so they call it. Very well staked there, right next to the seedling. Most people usually zip tie the fence to the stake, and this helps protect the seedling, usually until it's shooting out of the tree tube, which I think most are usually 5 feet tall now these days instead of 4 feet. So yeah, I just throw in some nice descriptions here, some pictures. You can always come back to. They're very, very descriptive. And, you know, there's 3 different pictures that really, really drive it home for what you're looking for when you're planting your seedling. Here's the J root picture that I was talking about. So there's the U or J root. It's the very second seedling that you see. That is no good. Pretty much all of these are what you don't want to see, right? You can actually see the very last seedling is a properly planted tree. This is a diagram that we actually use at the Conservation District when we have planting events to show the public what the proper way is and actually what the improper ways are of what it would look like to plant those. This diagram's here for all of you. I don't need to dive into it too deep because it is very, very descriptive in each seedling. There are also ways that you can heal in plants. So let's say you buy a huge group of plants like the middle picture, and you don't have time to get them in the ground right away. Well, you can heal in plants, which is shown depicting on the right. You just take out a little bit of shovel of the earth at about a 45-degree angle there, and take out the soil, lay the plants so they're still upright, cover the soil up. Remember, not about that root collar. That's very important. Pack it down and then cover. You can cover it with some wood chips. That's good for moisture, and that keeps the seedling safe. It's good. That's a safe way to actually plant seedlings and hold them there until you're ready to plant. So I'm going to dive into the aftercare. This is going to go pretty quick. It's pretty repetitive and pretty redundant. So we're going to want to make sure that you're frequently watering this seedling. You want to check on it. This is you spent time, you spent money here. You want to check on this seedling. Is the stake still standing and secure? Is the tree tube still attached? I know they're simple, but these are important. Remulch. Was enough rain? Are they looking too super dry and bad? It doesn't hurt to rake away or leaf blow away, or put in some new wood chips. It helps retain that water for the tree and the soil around that tree. You want to assess for wildlife damage. That's huge too. Whether it's the deer eating the root tips off, or sorry, not root tips, limbs off, or the tops off, the rabbits girdling around that the bark at the base of the tree. Are the birds? Well, birds don't usually affect it too much unless you're dealing with woodpeckers. But the porcupines are also very detrimental to some trees. You need to be aware also that some of these seedlings may die. They don't have the greatest living rate, So you definitely want to make sure you're tending to your seedlings, but expect to at least replace some of seedlings. But however, if you can get the seedlings or the seedling that you were planting to live at least 3 years, you're looking pretty solid on that seedling living. Keep vegetation down from the site, right? So this is important. Weed whacking, trimming some excess vegetation. The less competition, the better. That's really what we're looking for, less competition. I went a little picture heavy in these last couple slides, but I just wanted to give some visualizations on some techniques and ways to go about it. So aftercare, redundancy, water, super important. We got different styles. We got the tree donut that you can fill up, the gator bag, which is seen around parks around town. Traverse City, out in Benzie, I've seen them at some parks and a couple things like that. Here's a good picture right next to the gator of the berm that was created and will hold almost probably that whole bucket of water. So that's important. Um, you can just see a couple of these different ideas on which people have done to water their seedling or trees they've planted. Stake and tree tubes. You just got to check them out. Get out there and look at your trees. How are they doing? Are they liking the tube? Is it benefiting? What's happening? So just be sure to check on your stakes, your tubes, your ties, your zip ties. It could be just regular um, shoestring. Make sure you're checking on those things and making sure they're secure and solid. That way you're not putting any stress or strain on your seedling. Mulching. Keep that mulch fresh. It's always good to have fresh mulch. Fresh mulch retains water. Um, However, on the far right, you can see that over mulching is a problem. That can put a lot of stress on that tree. In the middle picture is a very good description of what it should look like. You got it away from the stem and it fans out. Plenty of wood chips, a lot of coverage for that root system. We're looking good. And on the left is a perfect picture description and of a way that it should look. Assess for that wildlife damage. You know, you might have to put a fence around your seedling. You might have to. I can't tell you that you will, depending on your location where you're at, but if you're planting out in farm fields or field edges or anything like that, you might have deer browse, you might have deer rub. Even in town, you might have that beautiful, cute little bunny is going to come out and just girdle and chew on that bottom part of the stem system on your winterberry or your oh goodness gracious, any of those little nice shrub bushes you're gonna want by your house or on your property in your landscape. Just be cautious and be aware of that wildlife damage and how you're gonna assess that problem. Fencing and tree guards, like I said, you're gonna want to be able to make sure that stake is solid, that tree is properly um, protected away from wildlife. Bottom left is the tree guard for the rabbits. It comes down by the base. You got your friendly deer up the top left trying to peek through the fence at the luscious, tasty tree that he can't get to. And yeah, I just got a couple options on there that you can see for ways to have your tree guards and fencing. But it's all very important and it is all based on what your goals are for your seedlings. And with that being said, I'm going to probably turn it over here to Ellie for the remainder of the webinar.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to share my screen. Da-da-da. All right. I think y'all can see that HREP update slide. So I've got so many things to tell you. It's 6:44. But I also want to leave plenty of time for questions. So if I'm speaking too fast, I'm sorry. I'm also speaking over a cat that's in here that's yelling at me. So if you hear him, just ignore him. He doesn't need any more attention. But let's start off talking about ATREP. So for those of you that don't know, ATREP is the Assisted Tree Range Expansion Project. It was started by my predecessor, Kama Ross, and a summer intern she had in 2019 named Maddie Baroli. And it was her capstone project for her master's degree from University of Toronto. And the whole basis of this project is that climate change is real, it is happening, and some organisms will not be able to react to it as quickly as others. An example of that would be our long-lived neighbors, our trees. So human-assisted or range expansion is the human-assisted movement of species to areas just outside their established range in response to that changing climate. And it's facilitating natural range expansion that would be happening anyway. So for example, Archangel Ancient Tree Archive, who's just south of us, is super awesome. But whenever one of us up here are planting one of their sequoia or redwood clones in our area, that's not necessarily tree range expansion because both those tree species are endemic to California climates and ecosystems. And so when we plant them over here, it's more just for fun, putting up an arboretum, not necessarily for building up climate resiliency in our forest and keeping forest cover in our latitudes of Michigan, right? This is a complicated project. I'm just giving you a quick overview. There is so much more to learn. This past year, I've done a lot of work cleaning up and adding a lot of information to the Leelanau Conservation District forestry pages, which you will see referenced multiple times while I'm speaking. But there's now an ATREP page on there that does a deeper dive into why we chose the species that we did, and the basis of the project. Touching on why we chose the species that we did. So the whole point of this project was it was based on computer modeling with different tools like the Tree Atlas through US Forest Service. So it was taking climatic projections for our area of Michigan. So our area being the 3-county service area I cover, Leelanau, Grand Traverse, and Benzie. And then various ecological needs and niches that are filled by these different species. And so the computer gave us different answers, like 30 some answers of species of like, this is stuff that is currently not at those latitudes that is projected to be able to thrive in those latitudes based on those changing climates. This is just a map to sort of give that idea, right? So as we have seasonality shifting, I don't know if some of you saw this, but last year, the USDA they updated their map for the seed hardiness zones in the US. That's based on the growing seasons at different latitude points. Things are shifting. The plants can tell. It's felt like May for the last 2 weeks if you're in the Traverse City area. So humans that have some perception, we can tell, right? Different things are waking up or flowering at earlier times than was historically known. So this is what ATREP is trying to respond to and be proactive about, right? The big part of ATREP is that it's a community science project. So folks in the last 4 years who have been buying these species, because we started selling the different species in 2020. The main thing that we want to do is we want to learn if the computer was right? And so we offer these different species at all 3 seedling sales, not necessarily every one. Not every species is offered at every district sale, but a lot of them are. And then we've got these different data forms. So these are just some little screenshots of those. They are Google forms. You can fill them out on your phone. I've got one that you fill out when you first want to participate. I just want to know who you are and where you're planting your trees. The other one is one you fill out per seedling. So whenever you send me a data point for that, I want to know about each individual tree. But again, we've changed the data forms, so they're just little checklists for each one. And it's very exciting now that since we've done these data form changes, we have some information to show you. So this is going to give you a little glimpse of where people are planting their seedlings. Obviously, Grand Traverse, the orange there, green is Leelanau, and red is Benzie. The folks that are participating the most are the folks that are in the service area I cover. Makes sense because that's where HREP happens. Though Antrim Conservation District, if anyone is calling in from that area of the state, they are partnering more purposefully with HREP this year and are offering all of the species at the moment. So let's jump to the next one because I keep referencing the species. Who are the species? So we offer, based on that computer modeling again, so these are all southern Michigan species that we're now selling up in this area to build climate resiliency in our northern hardwoods. So it's American sycamore, black gum, bur oak, common hackberry. Sassafras was offered as a species, and we've actually stopped because I did more research about it. Based on the data we got back, the sassafras seedlings that we were planting weren't doing very well, and I did some more research, and apparently they're not very good for transplanting. They're better for seeding projects. But shagbark hickory, swamp white oak, and tulip tree. So it's cool to see as far as the data that again, you can see there's 269 responses for the tree collection form. So each of those responses is about an individual tree, right? So folks have been planting a mix of species across all the years of this project. But how are they actually doing? Well, a lot of the responses are showing that everybody's alive, pretty much, that almost 80%, right? Incredibly misleading because it's very hard to find a dead seedling, right? It would just look like a little stick that is somewhere out in your woods. If you didn't put a flag next to it, it'll be very hard to find. So not all of the data, it looks more positive than it might actually be accurate because there's been some feedback, just anecdotal evidence that folks have lost some of different species, hence the whole not offering sassafras anymore. But I thought this graph might be interesting too. It's just giving an idea of like what the average height are of the seedlings this far along. Something to keep in mind though, so I don't have any data about bur oak yet, but swamp white oak, shagbark hickory, and bur oaks, those all have those deep tap roots. So when you're handed a bunch of them as seedlings, you're not going to see a lot of above ground growth in the first few years of their life because they're putting a lot of effort building those root systems when you first plant them out there. And so that's true for all those different oak and hickory species. Okay, that's all for HREP at the moment. And again, we'll be able to answer questions at the end. But now let's talk about matching species to your sites. The main thing of this next section of the presentation is your planting is going to be so much more successful if you take the time and understand the local ecosystem that is your property versus buying a whole bunch of whatever your favorite tree is and trying to manipulate your property to be the best space for that seedling, right? So for example, if you live on a dry sandy hillside, some remnant dune in Leelanau County, you don't really want to buy and plant a bunch of wetland species or things that like it a little more mesic, right? So you wouldn't want to drop a lot of dollars on a bunch of American sycamore and black gum and things that like to be on the fringes of wetter areas and sticking on top of that very dry hillside. You'd want to be thinking more about black cherries or different oak species or things that are found in those sites in nature, right? Otherwise, you're going to really be carrying a lot of water up that sandy hill to keep that tree alive. There are a lot of different things for you to look into as you're walking around your property. And I have a lot of virtual resources for you to do a deeper dive into some of this different stuff. But things to note so just like Cam was saying, when you're going to answer the question of why am I planting these seedlings, you also want to know what seedlings can I actually purchase based on things like the amount of sunlight that's in the space that you want to be planting in. The local hydrology of your area, is it that wetland? Or what type of soils do you have? Are there soils that are going to be really well draining and regularly dry, which would be important to note because we keep flirting with drought multiple times a year, right? The topography and aspects, if your land is hilly, where do those hills face? Do you own the northern side of a slope or the southern side of the slope? That's going to influence both of those above points, right? How much sunlight your seedlings are going to get and how much water is going to be available in those soils. A southern aspect is going to have more direct sun radiation, And so you're going to have more evaporation happening in that space than you would the northern side of a hill, right? Simply the available physical space. Are you planting trees that are going to end up being very large and you've got those power lines, or they're too near your home, or even just too close to the other trees that you've already have there? What other species are present in your area? Are there any threats or hazards to your area? And then what kind of wildlife might be moving through? Or do you have any pests that you need to be concerned about when you're selecting your species? For the first part of this, I'm really going to dive into those top couple things. So again, there's a whole continuum that is out in the environment. Ecological conditions, environmental conditions, they don't know how to read a plat book. Nothing is just sort of stuck on property lines, besides, I guess, if you butt up right to a shoreline, right, or a river. That can happen. But in general, you're going to have microclimates throughout the space that you own. And so in those dry, sandy upland sites is where you're going to have more red pines and bur oaks and white oaks, versus those mesic bottomlands is when you're going to start having your maple trees and your ash trees. That's where you could start thinking about those tulip trees to put in. When you go into wetlands, when those soils are very saturated, there are certain trees that can handle that, and there's a lot, like red pines, that would not thrive very well in very saturated soils. So that's where you're going to find more of your willows and different birches and cedars, right? And even so there's the whole world's a continuum across all these different types of conditions. Trees are going to exist in that range of environments. So this picture is like this really dry agriculture field that's fringed by all these red maples, to this other picture where these red maples are growing right out of the water, right? Trees they can't move, so when they're seeded into a space, they have a certain amount of genetic material that can help them handle different conditions, right? In general, though, and again, what I'm going to talk about a lot through this talk, the major limiting factors of any one environment is the available water and how much sunlight a tree is going to be able to get in the spot that you're choosing to plant it in. Having said that, though, with all the recommendations I'm going to give you, trees can't read, so they don't totally follow the rules all the time. You could potentially have a successful planting of choosing something that's more of a wetland species and put it on that dry sandy hill behind your home, and you might have some that actually survive. They have such wild genetics, and I looked up some fun facts for you. In general, trees have more genetic material than humans do. If you want to think about it this way, it's like they're sitting there with all these blueprints because they don't have locomotion, right? They can't walk away from their problems. So they're sort of sitting there with all this genetic material of like, okay, if it gets super dry, like this is the level of drought I can deal with. This is the level of flooding I can deal with. They have all these, or if this is how much browse I can handle, or how I respond to different insects and diseases, right? Because they can't run away from any one problem that might be happening. They've got a lot of information in their bodies to deal with stuff. So just some not totally related, but fun facts are fun, right? So human beings, we have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, so 46 of them is in a set. Basswoods have 82 chromosomes in a set. Silver maple have 78 chromosomes in a set, and white ash even have 138. So again, we only have 46. Not saying that trees are going to be landing on the moon anytime soon, but it's cool to think of that every time you're planting a tree, even with all these recommendations that me or my colleagues are giving you, they have so much information to be able to deal with different types of factors. They can even be polyploidy, which means that they can have multiple chromosome sets, so even an extra abundance of different genetic material to potentially handle different types of conditions. I say all that and that you should still listen to me, and I'm going to give you a lot of recommendations of what trees to plant where, and what to consider with doing so, but just also know that if you're caring for something right, there are chances for things to survive in areas that would be surprising. Okay, so sunlight. Whenever you talk to a forester about sunlight, they're in the different tree species in a forest, they're going to use the phrase shade tolerance or shade intolerance. And so what does that actually mean? So shade tolerance is how well a species is able to handle the limiting amounts of sunlight. Sunlight is the main resource that us as humans can manipulate when it comes to forest management. So when you're doing a harvest, it's not just simply the quality of the timber product that you're harvesting out of the woods. It's also thinking about what type of space you're leaving left to get the regeneration in a forest that you want, because different tree species need certain light levels to actually be successful in photosynthesizing. So to think about this, I'm a visual thinker. I'm also a data thinker. So I like showing graphs every once in a while. We've got 4 graphs here. The 2 on the left, those are shade tolerant species. So Acer saccharum, that's your sugar maples, and then Fagus grandifolia, that's your American beech. The shade intolerant species, Prunus serratna, that's your black cherry, and Beulah papyrifera, it's a word I mostly read and not say aloud. That's your black cherry and your paper birch, right? Your shade tolerant trees can handle having lower amounts of light because they have a lower requirement of light to hit their peak production, right? So you see how they are below that number 4 on that y-axis. So they need lower light levels to be able to hit the maximum level of photosynthesis that that leaf is going to be able to do, versus the black cherry and the paper birch. They don't hit that peak until they need more sunlight to be able to function to have that full photosynthesizing power. For any of those graphs, the reason they flatline, a leaf is still, it's a bodily organ, right? We all have biological limitations. So even when conditions are perfect, when they're getting the sunlight they need, they have the right water, they've got space, you're still going to be limited on how much actual like glucose can be created in that chemical reaction, because it's a chemical reaction based on biological function. And that biological function is based on all those different environmental conditions, right? How much light they're getting, is water available, and do they have the right carbon dioxide and oxygen requirements being met to be able to photosynthesize fully. Shade tolerance is important when you're thinking of planting seedlings because it's a gradient across different, there's a gradient across different species, and it comes from forest succession. So some species are very tolerant. They can handle lower levels of light and still hit their peak photosynthesizing power. Where there are some species that are intolerant. They really need to be at the upper parts of the canopy or more out in the open to be photosynthesizing at their full potential. Then there's also those intermediate ones that makes this slide look very messy because I just threw them in the middle. I didn't know where to put them. So for example, over at this very tolerant line, those hemlocks, that's some of the most shade tolerant trees in the state, right? You know when you're hiking through the woods, when you see a patch of hemlocks, because they make the darkest, truest shade. And it is silly to try to plant immediately underneath hemlocks. They can handle being underneath another canopy, and then they can use the last little bit of light that this other hardwood overstory is missing with their leaves. And then when something happens to that maple or aspen or whatever's over top of them, then they'll fill into that space. So when you're hiking around, and that's why you're seeing there's a lot of beech in the understory of these closed canopies and lines of little young sugar maples, it's because they can handle those lower light levels in that closed canopy. When you reduce some of that canopy cover and make some gaps, that's when you can start having a lot of those black cherries and tamaracks and jack pines move in. So this is just very helpful in not necessarily thinking about like, oh God, I need to do a whole harvest in order to plant trees. Also just in looking through what your space is like, and where different pockets are. Because again, you don't really want to be buying up something that needs that full sunlight to really hit its full potential and grow well and be able to make habitat for wildlife if you're not going to meet the sunlight needs that it has. However, I say all that, and that shade isn't necessarily a bad guy. Nursery trees are a thing, right? Some areas, especially as we keep flirting with drought multiple times this summer, um, it's a lot of sunlight can be really tough to get going. Fallow agriculture fields, doing a big reforestation project in that is very tough because they are out in the open and in the elements. And so just being buffeted by wind and just being scorched by sun and not having a lot of soil moisture availability in those soils, that can be tough. But if it may be more successful to plant more along the fringes of the forest that already exists and encourage the forest to grow into an open space that you want to fill with trees. That might give you more success because along the edges of where those established trees are, there's going to be those microclimates where, yeah, there's going to be shade. That shade's going to cause a reduction in the evaporation happening from solar radiation. So you'll have pockets of soil moisture still available within the substrate. So for example, I gave you all this really awesome looking diagram that I threw together earlier this afternoon. So a gap in a canopy. You got trees all the way around that circle. I just gave you the ones on the bottom. If that top seedling in the north of a canopy gap is actually going to receive more direct sunlight than a seedling that you plant on the southern end of a canopy gap. Why? That doesn't make sense. We talked about aspect, where a southern facing slope is going to receive more direct solar radiation. That canopy gap is created by these tall, sometimes 60, 70, 80-foot trees, right? When you plant something on the southern end of that, it's going to be shaded by those tall things that are next to it, versus the northern side of that gap is going to actually get that direct sunlight. So just something to consider as you're choosing your species and thinking of the site you're going to put them in. This is another very small way that both of those factors, sunlight and moisture, can be influenced by the trees that are currently there. Let's do a deeper dive in the soils. Super fun. Different soil types are going to grow different types of trees. Again, with that whole idea that water is one of the most limiting factors of plant communities. So there are different soil types, and they're made up of different particles, different proportions of soil particles. So sand, that's your largest particle size, and then silt, and then clay is really itty bitty. The different sizes of those particles are going to influence the different pockets or gaps that are between those particles, right? Think of a bunch of golf balls, or even like, let's think of sand. Think of even basketballs in a basket versus filling a bunch of marbles into that basket being clay. You're going to have much bigger pockets between all those basketballs, between all those sand particles, and that's where you're going to have a lot of availability for when it does actually rain and stay there, water to be there and stuff, versus clay is going to keep things stuck, right? And so knowing what your soils are, because that's going to influence how much water is in your space, is super important and helpful. And it's also something to remember that all of Michigan's landscapes, Upper and Lower Peninsula, have been influenced by a history of glaciers, right? From glaciers receding about 11,000 some years ago when the last ice age ended, to climate history. Again, the climate change, that's why we lost those glaciers. And it's still shifting now, right? Due to some human influence. And then even the biological history of the space, the other organisms that have lived there, but also human influence. And so all these different things have shaped your landscape and have altered your soils a little bit, which will then in turn impact the success of your planting now. To learn about your soils, besides just walking through your yard and digging some holes and taking a peek, there are some virtual resources for you to play with. So the USGS Soil Survey is one that I use every once in a while to be helping landowners make their decisions. This one looks very big and spooky because it's a screenshot of the whole like Glen Lake area, because I gave a talk to their garden club a couple weeks ago. But this is a really awesome resource to get a better handle on the proportion of those different particles in your soils. And then again, with that, that's important to know because it'll show how it influences the available soil moisture in your space. I highlight the website down below there for you to look into it deeper. And I made a mention that human history, obviously we have altered how different landscapes look. But even without human influence. So the map to the left is a map of different soil types in Michigan. And then the map to the right is different forest types for circa 1800. I saw this map being set as like pre-colonization. So pre-1800 a little bit. That's sort of when we've had our big cutover start of cutting down a lot of trees. European colonists moving from the Atlantic coast over this way into Michigan. Anyway, before we had that big shakeup in our environment with the rise of European colonization through the lake states, the forest types were very much influenced by the soils that are in there. So if you look between those different colors and the different forest types that are in a spot, it's very indicative of what soils are in a spot. And again, that comes back to what type of moisture is available based on those soils. Now, obviously, like I said, we've had a lot of human impact and development and parking lots and Burger King drive-throughs show up. So we've changed some things. And again, that's going to some of those areas that have had a lot of human development and change are going to be some tough areas to reforest. So a fallow agriculture field is going to be a much different beast, and there should be a lot more considerations into the site prep and the mulching of those species that you're putting in there versus if you're just trying to increase the diversity of a forest you already have and interplanting some stuff in the canopy gaps. Let's talk a bit more about, so again, matching species to sites. Sometimes can be super helpful to just sort of see what's already there and maybe add a bit more to the diversity you're already seeing in your parcel, right? So these next couple slides, I'm going to talk about just some example forest communities that I come across regularly in my Tri-County area. And it can sort of give you a good menu of what to choose from when you're selecting species to purchase. So a northern mesic hardwood. I don't know if I defined that earlier, but mesic is the opposite of xeric. Xeric starting with an X. Those are drier soils versus mesic are going to be more your bottomland hardwoods. The toes of slopes, they're not necessarily going to be ecosystems that are very much in the wetland or running into open water. These are just areas where you'd likely find vernal pools, or again, just as this slide's saying, it's where you're going to find a lot of cool spring ephemerals and trilliums and stuff. So your northern mesic hardwoods, and talking specifically about the trees and the ones you might be seeing at the seedling sale. So the primary tree species of this forest type is going to be your different maples, sugar and red maples. You're going to have hemlock groves. You'll have the occasional basswood mixed in there. And especially near the hemlocks, you'll have the occasional yellow birch. Some secondary tree species, American beech trees, occasionally in the overstory, and then also in some of these maple-dominated overstories, I see a lot of beech regeneration underneath, right? Because they're shade tolerant. They can handle being under other canopies. The occasional black cherry, some quaking aspen, and some white ash trees, which again, ash has been on a sad trajectory since emerald ash borer showed up in Michigan in 2002, but you still come across the occasional ash tree. As I already said, this is where you're going to have some really beautiful spring ephemerals in your understory plants. These are going to be some richer soil types. That loam is that equal proportions of sand, silt, and clay. So higher nutrient content and organic material and soil moisture availability. This forest type is more, so it's closer to the lakes. So in thinking of my service area specifically, Leelanau, Grand Traverse, Benzie, it is more Leelanau County is a lot of this, western Benzie County, and just some areas around inland lakes in the Grand Traverse County area. Because actually, in flipping to this next slide, a lot of Grand Traverse, especially as you move east on Grand Traverse, you're going to start going more into that northern dry hardwoods because you're going to have an increase in the sand content in those soils. So the primary tree species in this forest community is going to be more pine heavy, your jack and red pines, and your red, white, and pin oaks, big tooth aspen. You'll also still see, especially along like the Boardman river systems, some red maples or paper birch. White pine will be hanging out in the understory and the overstory, of course, and balsam fir, especially near some of those waterways. Understory plants for this area, which again is not super important for your seedling sale, but just also helpful to know if you're walking through your yard, like, is this the site that I have? You'll see some blueberry bushes, sweet fern, which if you haven't crushed that up and smelled before or shoved it in your top of your pocket to hike around with and sniff later, it's very lovely if you haven't come across it yet. Bracken fern, Pennsylvania sedge, bearberries, winterberries, poverty grass, a lot of different things. This is a drier ecosystem, right? So you're not going to have as much of the spring ephemerals. Soils are tending to be more acidic, which is sort of influenced by having that oak and pine overstory, but also just simply like the parent material that's there, having more of those sand content in that space. And yeah, I already talked about the location. So as you head east to my service area, east in Grand Traverse, you'll come across a greater concentration of this forest. Rich conifer swamps. This is going to be more up in Leelanau, and then there's a couple patches in the other two counties. So the main species in this is going to be that northern white cedar. But then, so if you own this forest type and you're like, man, there's just a silly amount of cedar in here, and then the deer are eating all the baby cedar trying to come up, look at all these secondary tree species that you could sprinkle into this forest. Balsam fir, tamaracks. Sorry, this just says spruces, but I mean black and white spruce, native Michigan spruces. Hemlocks, white pines, black ash trees, which again, if you find a black ash, please call me and let me know because I do not think I will see one in my lifetime. Red maples and yellow birch. So again, if you own a space that's more of a wetland that has mainly dominated like 90% northern white cedars, there's all these other species that you can incorporate into here. Something to note too, a lot of the atrep species are more wetland species. So you could try swamp white oak and black I always blank when I have to actually bring them up. American sycamore, shagbark hickory. A lot of those could be on the fringes or some of them even within an ecosystem like this. So wetlands are really awesome, very diverse places. And this is due to a whole number of factors, but it's that combination of that land and water mixing in, right? So you have a bunch of microclimates lining up. So the soils in this are going to be pretty saturated, especially so into the spring when you have snow melt, and there'll be high amounts of organic matter. Excuse me, high amounts of organic matter and a lot of available soil moisture. For all three of those things, because that was those forest communities, that was a huge coverall with this. If you haven't heard of Michigan Natural Features Inventory, that's where that one map with the pre-colonization that I had with the soil map came from. But there is such a wealth of information in this, and it can be especially helpful if you have bought a parcel that has had some, like a history of agriculture, and you see that part of the woodlot matches the description of one of these spaces. It's a great way to learn more about the overall, they have species list for the overstory, midstory, and understory of all these different forest communities. And so with the seedling sales that we're currently in, or even the native plant sale that happens in May, there is a lot of great information that can help influence the decisions of what you should buy and what you should plant where, that can be found on this site. And that MNFI feature and the USGS soil survey that I talked about 17 years ago, you can find that under the forestry page on the leelanaucd.org website. This is where I do the most work online as far as curating spaces of resources for landowners. And there's a whole heck of a lot of information on there to expand on not only what we're talking about right now, but all sorts of other cool stuff. Obviously, I'm here to answer your questions too, but this is just sort of a nice way for people who are real go-getters and want to do deep dives on their own to be able to find a lot of really good information that fill my bookmark folders on my computer, and I'm like, that's not helpful for everybody, so I put them somewhere that other people can access them to. So yeah, with that section of the talk, we mainly talked about those three things, but again, still think about the available physical space that you've got for planting in where you'd like your planting site to be. Also, those other species present. So that bottom right corner, that's a black walnut grove. Black walnuts are in the family Juglanaceae, and they put out this toxin from their roots. They are allelopathic, super fun word. And they put out this toxin called juglans from the root tips, and that can impair other plants' abilities for seeds to germinate in that space, for things to successfully grow in that soil space nearby black walnuts. So I say this in that if you're buying a lot of seedlings from the district because you want to diversify the species you've got in your area, or even just diversify the strata, right? It's good to have some different ages of things, not just different species. It may not be helpful to plant any young trees too close or immediately underneath black walnuts, because black walnuts are really good about making the environment suitable for more black walnuts. Similarly, that spookier picture in the top left is a big old stand of autumn olive, also an allelopathic. That one's problematic though, in that that's a non-native beast, and it can make really awesome big thickets that are really great for other autumn olive trees and not a whole lot for other things. So be aware of this stuff. Be aware if you're building or planning on building a house, how close that's going to be to where you're thinking of planting seeds right now, because that's a development and building human infrastructure could be pretty damaging and hard on the soils and shift the hydrology of your natural space. And so if you've got any like long-term plans for doing any big projects, may not want to be putting any seedlings right where you're going to be doing that. And we'll talk about this later too. I've got a slide about some more pests, but that bottom one, that's an example of hemlock woolly adelgid, and not going to touch on it too much right now. If you got questions, again, I'll talk a little more later, but I'm here for you as a resource. Cam brought this up too, just to emphasize that physical space, right? This is a diagram from this, it's called the Tree Owner's Manual. It's made by the U.S. Forest Service. So a lot of people that are smarter than me get into a room and they write up this manual of all sorts of great information about pruning trees and planting trees and where to plant what. I have a whole box of them that I'm going to bring to all 3 of my seedling sales, so different landowners can scoop that up as a resource. But also, if you're interested, just ask and I can email you a copy of the PDF also. This is just some great reminders for not like how Cam was saying, probably just shrubs under trees, right? But even so, like, be cognizant of where your septic system is, where your water lines are. Please call Mistig and have them flag out where different things are in your space. Because even if you're planting, they're seedlings, right? Like the oaks and stuff we're handing you, the white cedars especially can be really itty bitty things. They're gonna grow to whole trees, right? And so you don't want to be setting yourself up for an expensive job with a tree care company later to cut back or remove something that you just happen to plant too close to where your infrastructure is. So just please be cognizant of that as you're thinking of what you want to plant where and what the full growth potential of those different species are. Okay, we're in the home stretch. Also, please do stretch if you've been sitting for a while. I've been in this chair for way too long today. But so let's talk about selecting species for meeting some of your management goals. Cam gave you this really awesome list of all these different things you should consider as like, why are you planting trees? Because not only, obviously, as we just talked about, you need to consider the site that you're planting for, but there's also all these other considerations that you have, like your own human goals for why you're doing this and why you're buying this stuff. For this final part, we're just going to focus on these bottom things. So attracting that wildlife, increasing biodiversity in your space, and then also just simply like your own aesthetics. As an example, this lovely picture is spicebush, and that is a plant that supports a lot of native Michigan pollinators. So that's a good guy. To talk about wildlife. What a big word, right? That refers to mammals. In general, like wildlife management has historically referred to game species. I went to Clemson University for grad school. That's very much their wildlife biology degrees are very much wrapped up in traditional like hook and bullet species, right? So creating habitat for white-tailed deer and turkeys and bear and uh, grouse and other things we like to hunt. That word, though, has expanded to include all of the fauna that is out in the woods. So now we're talking about vernal pools and your salamanders, and that we're part of a songbird migratory pathway being on this western edge of Michigan, and all sorts of cool stuff. So, in thinking of that, all these different wildlife have different needs at different times of their life. So, those needs, they're going to vary across their lifetime. The four main things that wildlife need at any given moment is food or forage, water, cover, and space, right? They have different territories. They are generally, they'll be raising their young in different places than where they might be foraging, which may be different from where they're going to actually get their water. So creating habitat is a super fun, complicated puzzle, but it's also nice to know because it's so dynamic and complex, any one thing that you do in one area might have a lot of positive impacts that you're not even aware of while you're planting in this space. It may be providing all these habitat factors for all these organisms that are moving through it, looking for one of those different needs, right? So different ecosystem types are not just forests are going to be meeting those, might be meeting all those different needs of different wildlife. Like, for example, there's a lot of different bird species that are seeking out cover and raising their young in the woods, and then they're doing a lot of foraging in open field spaces, right? The needs of different wildlife are also going to vary across the calendar year. So I like talking to folks about the calendar of color. Again, thinking of like all three of those goals: wildlife attractants, aesthetics, biodiversity. Having something for some organisms to forage at every given point in the growing season not only gives you flowers throughout the whole year, but you're also helping to feed and support a multitude of different types of organisms across the whole continuum. For example, I have people who will buy pollinator mixes, and they're very Asteraceae heavy. Sunflower family members, a lot of different solidagos or goldenrods or asters or coneflowers or different things. And a lot of those species flower later in the summer. And they're not small, they're herbaceous plants, but they can get pretty hefty and tall. So then this person's like, well, shoot, I just planted this entire pollinator patch. And for most of the growing season, it's just this big wall of green and just leaves until like end of July when it finally starts doing something for me. So it's more fun for you, and it's more fun in a way for all the habitat you're trying to make if you're thinking about incorporating that type of diversity in your space too. So the phenology of these different plants, and that word just means the timing of different actions that a plant does throughout the year. So the bud break to when they actually leaf out to when they're flowering versus when they're fruiting and when they're seeding. If you plant things that have slightly different phenology calendars, you're going to be supporting so many different things throughout the entire year. Which, again, is that last point. That will make you not only beautiful landscapes for you, but then also incredibly functional landscapes for everything that's living around you. So let's go back to like third grade really quick and talk about some food webs of different things. Pretty sure we're all familiar with the life cycle of a bird, but just in case they're starting off in eggs, then they're gonna have these birds that hatch that are oftentimes pretty helpless. They need help with the parents and brought food for them to then get to that older age to be fledglings and leave the nest and become that adult bird, right? Different points of this life cycle, they are eating different things. Again, thinking like third grade, maybe second grade. I feel like everyone in their early elementary does some, like they raise some caterpillars in their class and let them go in the flowers. I don't know. But swallowtail butterflies, right? They're starting off as teeny tiny eggs that they lay on a leaf. Then they hatch into caterpillars that they munch up all those different leaves and they become a chrysalis that's usually like hidden up on a plant somewhere, which then they'll hatch into the butterfly and go on doing their awesome pollinator things. moths exist, right? Very similar to butterflies. Something I wanted to note about moths, though, when they're in that caterpillar, or sorry, when they're in that pupa stage, when they're in that cocoon, a lot of butterflies, they'll be putting, and this is a huge generalization, there's hundreds, if not thousands of species of each. I'm not an entomologist, but they'll be putting their chrysalis up onto things. Moths will pupae under in the ground in the organic material underneath trees. So that caterpillar is munching on different leaf material. Then it goes in that pupae stage and it's going to be in the duff layer under a tree. Another thing to think about is making, say if you're a person who loves your yard, you've got a lot of turf, that's okay. I'm not saying to change everything to native plants. I like to play frisbee and bocce, and so I like having a mowed lawn for doing that stuff too. But if your lawn goes right up to the edge of your grown trees you've got in a space, you're going to lose that little bit of the life cycle for something like a moth, where it spends part of like the dormant part of its life in cover spaces like that. So maybe think of making like habitat islands if you're in a more urban setting, or if you have more of a yard that you own. Plant some ferns or some different native pollinator things, different types of plants, herbaceous things, grasses, underneath those canopies of those different trees. So some of these different organisms can successfully complete that part of their life cycle without getting disturbed by your lawnmower or anything. Anyway, that was just an aside. So why do I bring all this up? Well, all these different things have different needs, right? Let's think about how these insects impact birds. I don't know if you've heard of this Doug Tallamy character. He's over in New England and he does research on mostly about oaks, but not just about oaks, other types of genuses or collections of cousins of tree species, how they support the various food webs and organisms that are within them in their respective areas in different New England forests. And he has found a lot of really cool information. And then not only how all those different trees support insects, but then also how all those different insects support further life, like these different birds. That adult bird is going to be going and bringing back hundreds of caterpillars to that nest of babies a day, which means that to get that nest of a few babies to that adult stage, it's going to take 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to do so. And this is important when you're thinking of what to plant where, because we think of pollinators as strictly that act of pollinating, but we miss some of the steps of like, there's all these other life cycles. Like if you're planting all of this forage for butterflies to go for when they're an adult, but you don't have the space for them to be those eggs to then grow to those caterpillars that munch on leaves to then eventually become that butterfly, you're not going to get butterflies, even if you're planting the flowers for butterflies. You know what I mean? Or you can put that bird feeder out, but if you haven't created the spaces for those birds to feed and raise their young to get to that adult stage, you may not really have any birds in your space. So to put some numbers behind this, this is a slide that I stole from the Northwest Invasive Species Network, which they populated this by information again from that Doug Tallamy. So a genus, again, that word just means it's like a collection of cousins. It's different things that are related. So Quercus rubrum, Quercus alba, these different oaks are part of that Quercus genus. So to break this table down, oaks, those are heavy hitters. This is just simply when it says species supported, that's just the different caterpillar species, insect species that are supported by these different genera of trees. So oaks, from what he has found, and this was back in 2007, I've seen recent research where some of these numbers are going to be a lot more than what they have on here. But if you're planting oak trees, willows, your cherries, especially your black cherries, right, or choke cherries, your native cherry species that are going to have thousands of years of evolutionary history with the insects that they will be supporting, or birch, elms, pines, chestnuts, that's all the different hundreds of insect species that that tree is going to be assisting through their life cycle, right? But not only that, that's how you're also going to be feeding so many baby birds. It's not planting with focus on one thing is not the worst idea, but it is cool to think about how all those different layers of that food web work off of these different trees that you're selecting. At the very bottom, there's some shade to ginkgos. Ginkgos are not native North American trees. I love them because the leaves are very adorable and they turn a bright yellow in the fall. You think of those like a statue, right? They support 5 species, compared to the hundreds that these other ones do. And so if you're doing a reforestation project, you don't want to necessarily emphasize ginkgos. You don't want to emphasize those redwoods that we talked about earlier, right? Because they don't have any type of history of Michigan food webs. And so they're not going to support the same breadth of things, not just these insects, but then again, in the bird example, all these other birds that are feeding off of them. And so this is just really helpful kind of stuff to keep in mind as you're selecting your species too. Off of the bird example, so that everyone knows that oaks are awesome for wildlife. I feel like we sleep too much on black cherry though. And black cherries are awesome because not only do they support those hundreds of insect species, which are getting those baby birds out of the nest, they also have a soft mast food versus an acorn being a hard mast. So those thinking of the different types of food that your plants produce is going to also impact how you're creating overall habitat for things. So those black cherry are awesome because they're supporting all these caterpillars that are feeding all those baby birds to get out of the nest, but then they also have those soft cherry fruits that then the adult birds feed on. Here are an example of cedar waxwings, which are super fun. But the plants they're feeding on are plants that are offered at, if not all, at least one of the seedling sales of my districts. So to the left there, you've got Michigan holly. It's also called winterberry. It's because it keeps its berries into the winter. So different songbirds and birds that don't migrate that stay through the Michigan winter. This is a great food source for different things. So it supports not only cedar waxwings, but also like robins, mockingbirds, and bluebirds. The thing to note with Michigan holly, well, actually 2 things to note. They are dioecious, so they've got male and female plants. And it's not super great to buy a small bundle of them just because you need both of those plants to actually create the berries to feed this wildlife. The other thing, they're super awesome for bird habitat, but they are toxic to mammals. So they're super beautiful and pretty, and they're super awesome for birds. But don't be letting your little kid pick these to eat them because they will get sick. That bottom right one is a picture of a serviceberry, and that plant supports all those different bird species that I just talked about, but 30 some other species of native Michigan birds. So in thinking about bird habitat specifically, these are 2 really great choices. Another place to learn more about making some bird habitat. This was a publication that was created like a couple years ago, Forestry for Michigan Birds. There is a link there to be able to find it. The Forest Owner's Guide is a little bit more of a synopsis versus the Forest Manager's Guide. It's a little bit thicker and really gets into like the silviculture of how to manage these different forest types to create bird habitat. But there's some really good recommendations if you're really jazzed about birds. Wanted you to know this publication exists because other people are also jazzed about birds and they want to help you manage your forest to create better, more bird habitat. I just had that focus about insects of not only how we're supporting these food webs and then just sort of moved away from the moment that there's all these different pollinators. A lot of ways to support insects is that there are a lot of different bees, moths, wasps, different things that interact with the flowers of various tree species. So not just supporting the caterpillars, but it is important to consider supporting insects in all these other ways. Tulip tree, that's at top left. That middle one is a American basswood. Then you've got a red maple over there, that bee that's covered with pollen, and a black cherry tree and a red bud. Red buds are cool if you're thinking of that calendar of color. They're one of the things that flower the earliest. So I'm thinking like the genealogy that trying to have different points of plant activity across the whole calendar. That's kind of a good choice for being like a really early bloomer. And then that one over to the left is little sycamore flowers. Not at all related to what we were just talking to, but another thing to consider is obviously those game species. We just dove into more like insects and birds. Something to think on for your mammals moving through your space, especially like your white-tailed deer herds and the like. Conifer thickets, having conifer patches through a mostly hardwood space, will create different pockets of cover. Again, there's food, water, cover, and space that wildlife's going to need. And conifers are really good geothermal pockets, especially in the winter, because they're going to be absorbing that sunlight when all those other trees are bare. And they're also helping to block the wind. So thinking of diversity and what to plant where in your space, it's kind of nice to have purposely put in little chunks of white or red pines or whatever makes sense again for the soils that you've got in your area. Again, just calling attention to that MNFI, all those different web pages about different forest community types and figuring out what forest you have. At the bottom of each of those pages where they describe like the different species list of different ecosystems, they also have wildlife considerations, but then also some management recommendations for these different forest types, which might be, each of those sections are only like a few paragraphs, right? You could have whole degrees about stuff or sit through college courses about all these different things. But this is a great start to get a lot of good information of what type of active management you could be doing in your space if you're interested in being a more active forest steward. Again, that and a lot of other great stuff to look into is in these forestry pages on the Leelanau website. And the last thing to note before we're going to take questions is there are a lot of different health concerns out there for different species. And just calling attention to some of them in that when you're doing your plantings, say if you're doing a larger scale planting, you don't want to necessarily buy all the same thing to plant hundreds of maples out there when that guy to the bottom right, Asian longhorn beetle, not in our state yet, loves maples though. And so if you just buy 500 maples, you might just be creating down the road when this species has made it here versus human vectors and the like jumping on our train systems and stuff. You might have just made a very big buffet that's going to really like and able to easily move through. Top right, that's a beech scale insect. The left is an emerald ash borer, and that bottom left is hemlock woolly adelgid. As you are thinking of buying species, it's good to think about diversity. Again, understanding those primary and secondary tree species that are endemic to the forest type that is on the land that you own. Another good example that I didn't really have a picture for that made sense here, but think of like oak wilt, right? So that's a fungal disease that the spores are carried by native insects to different injured trees. The insects are attracted to exposed sap. If that spore gets into that tree, then that infected tree can die in a matter of months. Its vascular system, though, can be connected to neighboring red oak trees. They readily root graft with neighbors to share carbohydrates and resources. But then unfortunately, that means they can also share this disease. So say if you just bought a bunch of red oaks, which is still a great tree. We just talked about how awesome oaks are. Everyone knows that oaks are awesome. But say if you just bought a bunch of red oaks and you planted them all in the same spots, that is not a very good, considering the risk of if one of those gets oak wilt down the line, it is so much easier for it to pass right to its neighbors. So if you're doing a larger forest reforesting project, if you've got a fallow agriculture field that you want to reclaim back as forest, think about creating that diversity, interplanting different things into that space. Make those conifer thickets for creating that thermal cover for different organisms, but also just mix things up. So if you get a pest or a disease that can be transferred to neighbors in that way, or if you've got a little crawler that can be able to move to the branches of other connecting canopy trees, mix them up so you hopefully negate the chance for that being able to happen as easily. Because again, for a lot of the forest types we talked about, they have a lot of different diversity. There's all those secondary species and primary species that are endemic to forest communities that are in my Tri-County service area. And so if you maintain that diversity, a diverse forest is going to be a more resilient forest. We're part of a global economy. There's always the potential for a different problem to come off of a shipping container. And we've got a lot of different problems here already in our country that are not going to go away anytime soon and are moving through forests in neighboring states. And so if you can keep curating that pocket of diversity in the parcel that you own, that's just going to be better long term for the forest that you have. Also, I love ending slideshows like this, because why are we even here talking about trees, or why are you even considering buying trees? Well, it's because trees make the world better for all these different reasons. I'm not going to read them to you. You know how to read. But first off, thank you for joining us in general, considering buying trees. Actually going to do all the hard work of planting those trees and taking care of them so they can get to adulthood. You are helping not only me, Allie, and Cam, but then all of your neighbors and the greater TC area just make the world a bit better of a place. So thanks for doing what you do. That's all any of us have for you. I was the long-winded one at the end of this conversation, but we've got 15 minutes. We had this slated to go till 8. Cam and Allie are still here unless I put them to sleep. And so we're all able to answer questions for you. Allie, Cam, what do you think? Should I just pull up the Q&As and go through the ones that are in there?
Yeah, there's a couple of really good Q&A ones there that I was hoping you would be able to address, but you were very busy telling us all those other wonderful things.
Oh yeah, I didn't open up the
Yeah.
Q&A while I was talking at all.
And then I know some of you have also noticed, but the chat is back up and working. Apologies for the technical difficulties earlier. So if you want to ask your question that way, or if you want to raise your hand, we can open it to let you talk. So you can ask your question that way as well. Lots of options.
All right, let's start with Ruta's question here. How does one go about diversifying species on land that was planted as a monoculture pine plantation? Well, if you've got a pine plantation that's never been thinned, and so you've got that closed canopy, again, thinking about how pine plantations aren't the most natural. That was a human choice to plant them that way, with the thought that they were reducing soil erosion and putting in a lot of tree cover into a space that may not have had some, like fallow agriculture field or something. And ultimately planted in a way to end up as a timber harvest. And so if you are lucky enough to just own a big chunk of red pine plantation, that is not the most natural ecosystem. And there is probably a lot of different hardwoods and stuff coming up in the understory that are going to be suppressed by that closed up canopy. So first you sort of got to think about, are you going to be doing any thinning of the red pine? Because if there's limited sunlight in that space, it is not worth it to think about the planting step yet, because you're going to run into not only the sunlight issues, but physical space issues, how much soil moisture is there to support those young trees, all that other kind of stuff. So you have a couple other sort of site prep things to consider before you can jump into the diversifying the space with a planting project. Are there some trees and plants that are more tolerant of juglans? Oh, that's a good question too. And I actually don't have a good answer for you. I don't know if it's because it's almost 8 o'clock at night. But the way I understand it, that it's a whole family of species that put out that toxin, right? And from what I understand, it's just they are really good at making that local ecosystem more suitable habitat for other members of the walnut family. So send me an email about that actually, because I love doing research and reading random things, and so I can see if I can find you a better answer if there are different plants that can withstand that. Oh man, okay. You're asking the list of woody plants ranked by ability to support butterflies, moths includes chestnuts. Are American chestnut trees able to survive? I just sat in a really cool webinar last week, and talking about American chestnut restoration and how awesome that tree was in general, but different strides that they have made since the chestnut blight was found in America back in like the early 1900s. So we've had over 100 years of restoration initiatives with crossbreeding programs, but now also using like biotechnology like CRISPR and different gene editing things. And so there are some, it's hard to claim like absolute resistance to any one thing, right? Again, we talked about how complicated the genetics are of different plants. Um, but there are different chestnut options out there. And of my 3 districts, Benzie does offer American chestnut trees. Theirs, I guess, are sourced from isolated populations of Michigan American chestnuts, because we're sort of outside the range overall. So there are some options out there. It's a mixed bag of how well they'll be able to deal with the blight, but there are a lot of good options that can withstand the infection due to a lot of different procedures that they've done. So again, actually, Ruta, you had those 3 baller questions in a row. If you want to send me an email about those, we can even have more of a meeting to talk about those answers. Oh, I had something to say about an earlier question. The tap roots for oaks. So yes, when your oaks and hickories are pulled up out of that nursery bed, that is I might have just said bread there. It's getting late. When they're pulled up from that nursery bed, their roots are pruned pretty significantly to actually get them shipped to the district. And then you saw in the pictures that Ali showed, we wrap them up and put some watered down newspaper in there and get them all tight. And they really got to go on the ground because they have had a lot of damage to their roots. The next few years after you've bought those trees, so the above ground, when you get that bundle of those different oaks and things, they're going to look comically short, but then there's going to be a whole bunch down here because that's trying to capture as much of this taproot as possible. They're not going to put a lot of above ground growth because they need to regrow some of that root system that they had lost in that traumatic week of getting uprooted and sent to us and packaged up all nice and given to you. So you're not going to see a lot of above ground growth when you first plant those species, but water the heck out of them because they are doing a lot of work underground to rebuild that root structure and send it out into the substrate. Sorry, I had just seen that question earlier and wanted to expand on that. One last thing I wanted to add too, that how long should a tree stay in a tree tube? Cam gave a really awesome answer. If the folks who are in here have not read that yet. Tree tubes are serving as protection from browse from wildlife, right? When that seedling's really little, when you first get in the ground and that tube's protecting the seedling. They are made from recycled, often they're made from, at least the more popular ones, the ones we're offering at the district, the ones you'll get from CRA, from recycled plastic from milk jugs. Okay, so they will make like a little greenhouse effect on that plant, trap a little moisture in there. It does diffuse the sunlight getting to that seedling though. So it sort of encourages that seedling to grow up. It wants to get out of that diffuse sunlight space and get to the open atmosphere. So when a seedling first pokes out of the top of that tube is then serving structural integrity as well as protection from browse, right? Because it's sort of like that middle schooler that just hit that growth spurt. It's going to be a very skinny, spindly thing in there. Or even like the house plant you have too far away from your window that's growing towards the window. Just because it's tall doesn't mean that it's doing like it's firing on all cylinders, right? So you should leave that tube on that seedling until it puts a little more girth onto it so it could deal with atmospheric pressure and weather moving around it. So it's too often I feel like people take them off after one growing season. The seedling pokes up and they like, you did it, and they remove this tube and then the seedling might fall over. So do check on those tubes and keep an eye on how the seedlings are growing in them, because it's going to be more how substantial is the seedling, not just simply how tall it is. You've all heard me talk for so long. Are there any other things while we're still here? Are bird nets being sold with tubes this year? Ooh, actually, that's a question for Allie. I don't know what you all are sourced with that.
Mine at GTCD I have nets. I guess a follow-up question to that is which district did you get your tree tubes from, or did you buy them with CRA?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Of the 3 districts, all 3 of them are part of CRA. So if you've got a wild roots package, we will have tubes for you. But then with the seedling sale, Grand Traverse and Benzie are the 2 of my coverage area that have them available. Allie, Cam, do y'all have any final thoughts? Or I guess we should shut off this recording at some point. Maybe edit that out when you go to post it.
Great. They just love the silence. No, I just want to say thank you again to everyone for joining us. Yeah, like I said in the chat, we'll have this recording posted online. We'll send the link to all of you guys, and we'll include the slide deck as well, because it did have a lot of really awesome resources. Cam just had some really good diagrams in there. Ellie included a lot of stuff as far as where to learn other things about all that wildlife. That was great. Joni, I'm so glad we convinced you to order tree tubes. Just seeing that, that's great. Yeah, and if you have any more questions, just let us know. We're here for you. And yeah, plant a tree.